Hey there, sleepyhead, I'm so glad you're here. This is the perfect moment to slow down and simply listen. Before we begin, don't forget to tap like and hit subscribe so we can share more quiet nights together. And leave a comment. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? I've been hiking the backcountry trails of the Pacific Northwest for 17 years, and I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at me, until that October night on the Cascade Ridge Trail, when I discovered that the most dangerous predators don't have claws or fangs. The air had that bone-deep cold that only comes at altitude after sunset, the kind that makes your lungs ache with each breath. I'd started the hike later than planned, a stupid mistake I'll regret for the rest of my life. But I knew the trail like the back of my hand. The Cascade Ridge Trail in the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest had been my sanctuary for years, a place where I could clear my head and reconnect with nature. I'd done this specific route dozens of times, including a handful of night hikes. Nothing ever fazed me anymore, or so I believed. My headlamp cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow dirt path ahead, while towering Douglas firs pressed in from both sides, their branches creating a canopy so thick that even moonlight couldn't penetrate. The only sounds were my boots crunching on fallen pine needles and my own steady breathing. Every so often I'd catch the distant rumble of a logging truck on the highway miles below, a reminder that civilization existed somewhere beyond this wall of trees. I was about 6 miles in, approaching a section of trail that wound along a steep ravine, when I first heard it. A voice calling out in the distance. Faint, but definitely human. "Help! Please, someone help me!" I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The voice sounded young, female, and terrified. My heart rate picked up, but my training kicked in. I'd done wilderness first aid courses, carried a satellite phone, knew the protocols. This was exactly the kind of situation I'd prepared for. "Hello?" I called back, trying to pinpoint the direction. "Where are you?" "Down here. I fell off the trail. I think my ankle's broken." The voice was coming from somewhere below the trail, down the slope toward the ravine. I approached the edge carefully, sweeping my headlamp across the darkness. The beam barely penetrated the thick undergrowth and fallen logs that littered the steep incline. "Keep talking so I can find you," I shouted, unclipping my pack to grab my rescue rope and first aid kit. "Please hurry, it's so cold." Her voice cracked with what sounded like genuine pain and fear. I started making my way down the slope, using tree trunks for support as loose rocks skittered beneath my boots. The terrain was treacherous, exactly the kind of place someone could seriously hurt themselves. My headlamp bounced with each step, creating disorienting shadows that seemed to move on their own. That's when the first detail struck me as odd. The voice hadn't moved. In 6 years of search and rescue volunteering, I'd learned that injured people rarely stayed perfectly still when calling for help. They shifted positions, crawled toward voices, did something that caused their voice to change direction or distance. But this voice came from the exact same spot, with the exact same volume, every single time. I paused about 30 feet down the slope, a cold sensation creeping up my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. "What's your name?" I called out, trying a different tactic. A pause. Just a second too long. "Sarah, please, I can see your light. I'm just a little further down." My pulse started hammering in my ears. Something was wrong, very wrong. I'd asked for her name, but she'd given it and then immediately redirected me to keep moving toward her. It felt rehearsed, mechanical. I swept my headlamp in a slow arc, and that's when I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. About 20 feet to my left, partially hidden behind a massive fallen log, was the unmistakable blue glow of a phone screen. Someone was crouching there in the darkness watching me. Not down the slope where the voice was coming from. Right there. Silent. Waiting. The voice called out again, and I realized with dawning horror that it sounded identical to the previous calls. Not similar, identical, like a recording being played on loop. My training evaporated, replaced by pure animal instinct. This was a trap. The voice was a lure, and I'd walked right into it. I didn't wait to see who or how many were hiding in those woods. I turned and scrambled back up the slope, adrenaline flooding my system. Behind me, I heard the sudden crash of branches and heavy footsteps, at least 2 people, maybe more, abandoning stealth for speed. "Hey, where are you going? We just want to talk," a male voice shouted, completely different from the recorded woman's voice that had lured me down. The shift from the helpless girl to this aggressive male voice confirmed every terrifying instinct screaming in my head. I hauled myself up using roots and tree trunks, my hands scraping against bark, lungs burning. My pack snagged on a branch and I ripped it free, hearing something tear. Behind me, the footsteps were getting closer. They knew this terrain. They'd done this before. I reached the trail and ran like I've never run in my life, my headlamp beam jerking wildly across the path ahead. My boots slammed against the packed dirt as I pushed my body past exhaustion. The trail had felt familiar and safe on the way in. Now every shadow seemed to conceal another threat. Every turn, a potential ambush point. I could hear them behind me, their footfalls heavy and deliberate. They were pacing me, staying just close enough to keep me in sight. They wanted me to panic, to make a mistake, to trip or veer off the trail into the darkness where they'd have the advantage. My satellite phone. I needed to call for help. I fumbled for it while running, my fingers numb from cold and fear. But the moment I slowed down to grab it, I heard them surge forward. They'd been waiting for exactly that, any moment of hesitation. I abandoned the phone attempt and just ran, focusing everything on putting distance between us. My 17 years of hiking these mountains became my only advantage. I knew that about a quarter-mile ahead the trail forked. The main path continued along the ridge, but a smaller, barely visible deer trail cut sharply right and descended rapidly through a boulder field. In daylight, it was dangerous. At night, it was nearly suicidal. But it was also nearly impossible to follow if you didn't know it existed. The fork appeared in my headlamp beam and I didn't hesitate. I veered right onto the deer trail, immediately killing my headlamp and plunging myself into absolute darkness. The risk was enormous. One wrong step and I'd tumble down the boulder field and break my neck, but I had no choice. I heard my pursuers thunder past on the main trail, their own lights visible through the trees for a few seconds before disappearing around a bend. They'd realized too late that they'd lost me. I stood there in the pitch black, hand clamped over my mouth to muffle my ragged breathing, every muscle trembling. The forest around me was utterly silent except for the pounding of my own heart. I waited 5 minutes, then 10. Finally, I heard them coming back, their voices carrying through the still air. She couldn't have just disappeared. Frustrated, angry, forget it. She's probably got cell service by now anyway. This voice was cold, calculating. We need to clear out before cops start showing up. I waited another 20 minutes after their voices faded before I dared turn my headlamp back on, keeping it at the dimmest setting. My hands shook so badly I could barely work my satellite phone, but I managed to get through to 911. The dispatcher kept me on the line while I carefully navigated back to the main trail and then pushed myself to cover the remaining miles to the trailhead. 2 sheriff's deputies were waiting when I emerged from the forest at 11:47 p.m. I've never been so grateful to see another human being in my life. They took my statement while I sat in the back of their patrol car, wrapped in an emergency blanket still shaking. I described everything: the recorded voice, the phone glow, the men chasing me, the specific location on the trail. The older deputy's face grew grim as I talked. "You're the 3rd person to report something like this in this area in the past 2 months," he said quietly. "The other 2, they didn't get away." The investigation revealed what I'd stumbled into. The men had been using a portable speaker with a recorded distress call to lure solo hikers off the trail after dark. Once their victims were isolated and disoriented in the ravine, they'd rob them, and in at least 2 cases that police know of, worse. They found evidence of multiple attacks at a campsite hidden deep in the woods: personal belongings, camping equipment, phones with the SIM cards removed. They arrested 2 men 3 weeks later based on my description and evidence from the site. But the lead detective told me something that still keeps me up at night. The amount of gear they recovered suggested there had been more victims than the handful of official reports. People who never made it out of those woods to file a police report. People whose disappearances might have been written off as hiking accidents or getting lost in the wilderness. I still hike, though I'll never do a solo night hike again. But sometimes when I'm on a crowded trail in broad daylight surrounded by other hikers, I'll see someone stopped on the side of the path, looking at their phone, and I'll wonder if they're really just checking a map or taking a photo, or if they're watching, waiting, playing a recording of someone calling for help, and waiting for the next good Samaritan to come running into the dark. The scariest part? Those men are in custody, but that detective said something that haunts me more than anything else about that night. He said, "The problem is, now that word's out, this method works. We're seeing copycat incidents in 3 other states. They're still out there and they're still hunting." The Ozark Highlands Trail in northern Arkansas had been on my bucket list for years, and that September weekend seemed perfect for a solo trek. The forecast promised clear skies, mild temperatures, and I'd finally carved out 3 days away from my job as a physical therapist to tackle a challenging 40-mile section. I'd hiked everything from the Appalachian Trail to the John Muir Trail. I'd handled black bears, mountain lions from a distance, and once even a copperhead that decided my sleeping bag looked comfortable. The wilderness didn't scare me anymore. That confidence almost got me killed. The first day went flawlessly. I covered 15 miles, set up camp near a creek, filtered water, ate my freeze-dried dinner while watching the sunset paint the sky orange and purple. The forest hummed with the usual evening sounds, crickets, an owl somewhere in the distance, leaves rustling in the breeze. Normal. Safe. The second day started just as well. I broke camp at dawn, following the white blazes that marked the trail through dense hardwood forest. The path wound through rocky terrain, past limestone bluffs, and across wooden bridges spanning narrow gorges. Around mile 23, roughly 8 miles from the nearest road access, I noticed something that made me pause. A bright orange ribbon tied to a tree branch, about 6 feet off the ground, just off the trail to the right. Now, trail markers come in all varieties. Official blazes, surveyor's tape, even unofficial markers left by local hiking groups. But this ribbon looked fresh, the color vibrant against the weathered bark. And there was something deliberate about its placement, like it was meant to catch attention. Curiosity got the better of me. I stepped off the trail to examine it, thinking maybe it marked a side trail to a viewpoint or water source not listed in my guidebook. That's when I saw the second ribbon, about 30 yards deeper into the woods. Then a third one beyond that. I should have turned back right then. Every wilderness safety course I'd ever taken said the same thing: stay on marked trails. But I'd gotten complacent, arrogant even, after all those years without incident. I convinced myself this was probably just an unmarked shortcut, maybe even a better route. I followed the ribbons deeper into the forest, my GPS watch tracking my deviation from the main trail. After about 10 minutes and maybe 200 yards off path, I found myself in a small clearing. The canopy opened up enough that sunlight actually reached the forest floor, illuminating tall grass and wildflowers. Beautiful, isolated, and in the center of the clearing stood a wooden pole, about 7 feet tall, with something attached at the top. I approached slowly, that familiar hiker's curiosity driving me forward. As I got closer, my stomach dropped. Tied to the pole was a hiking boot. A woman's boot, size 7 or 8, weathered and faded, but definitely not old enough to be some historical artifact. The laces were still tied. My hands went cold despite the warm afternoon air. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the clearing, and that's when I noticed them. More ribbons. At least a dozen tied to trees all around the perimeter of the clearing, creating a perfect circle. This wasn't a trail marker. This was something else entirely. The boot wasn't alone. I spotted a water bottle half buried in the grass, a torn piece of a backpack strap hanging from a low branch, and this sent ice through my veins. A driver's license in a plastic bag, pinned to a tree with a nail. I didn't touch it, but I could see enough. A woman's face. An Illinois address. An expiration date from 2 years ago. This was a trophy display. Someone had been bringing things here. Personal items from hikers. And they'd created this elaborate ribbon system to market, maybe to find their way back, maybe to lure others in. The calculated nature of it, the organization, the presentation, this wasn't some random scattered debris from lost hikers. This was intentional. This was a collection. My breath came faster as the realization crashed over me. I pulled out my phone, no service, of course, we were too deep in the wilderness, and started backing away from the clearing. I needed to get back to the main trail, get to higher ground where my satellite messenger might work, contact rangers, police, someone. I'd taken maybe 5 steps back toward where I'd entered when I heard it. A twig snap. Somewhere behind me, back in the direction of the main trail. I froze, every sense suddenly hyper-alert. The forest had gone quiet. No birds, no insects. Just that heavy, oppressive silence that means predator nearby. Except the predator this time walked on 2 legs. Lost? The voice came from my left, not where I'd heard the twig snap. Male, casual, friendly even, which made it infinitely more terrifying. I spun around and saw him standing about 40 feet away, partially obscured by trees. Middle-aged, average build, wearing hiking clothes that looked expensive and well-used. He had a backpack, trekking poles, even one of those wide-brimmed sun hats. He looked like every other serious hiker I'd ever met on a trail. Completely normal, except for his eyes, which were studying me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "No, I'm good," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just exploring. About to head back to the main trail." "Those ribbons are easy to follow, aren't they?" He took a step closer, his smile not reaching those cold eyes. "I've been maintaining them for years. They bring interesting people out here. People who are curious. People who don't follow the rules." My hand slid slowly toward the bear spray on my hip strap. "I was just leaving." "But you found my collection?" Another step. "You know what that means, right? You're going to tell someone, rangers, police. They'll come out here and take everything. Years of work, gone." He said it so matter-of-factly, like he was discussing a stamp collection or vintage coins, not evidence of God knows how many crimes. The casual tone was somehow worse than if he'd been raging or threatening. This was someone who'd rationalized everything, who'd done this enough times that it had become routine. I didn't wait for him to get closer. I turned and ran, crashing through the undergrowth in what I desperately hoped was the direction of the main trail. Behind me, I heard him start to follow, not running, just walking with steady, unhurried steps, like he'd done this before, like he knew I couldn't outrun him forever in this terrain. The ribbons that had led me here now became obstacles, hanging at eye level, trying to catch my face and clothes as I ran. I batted them aside, my breath coming in ragged gasps, legs pumping as branches whipped against my arms and face. My backpack bounced painfully against my spine, throwing off my balance. I burst through a thick stand of brush, and suddenly the ground disappeared. I'd run straight to the edge of a limestone bluff, a 15-foot drop onto jagged rocks below. I skidded to a stop with my boots literally hanging over the edge, windmilling my arms to keep from falling. His voice came from behind me, still calm. "Nowhere to go now. This is why I like this spot. Natural boundaries. The cliff on one side, that ravine on the other. The main trail just far enough away that nobody hears anything." I turned to face him, my back to the drop, hand finally closing around the bear spray. He was standing about 20 feet away, completely relaxed, like we were having a pleasant conversation. That's when I noticed the hunting knife in his right hand held casually at his side. "You know what the really beautiful part is?" he continued, taking another step. "I've been doing this for 6 years. 6 years, and you're the first person who's even found this clearing. Most people stick to the trails like good little hikers, but every once in a while someone like you comes along. Someone curious. Someone who thinks they're experienced enough to handle anything. My mind raced through options. Fight? I was fit, but he was bigger, had a knife, and clearly had done this before. Jump? 15 feet onto rocks with a full pack would probably break both my legs. Run left or right along the cliff edge. He'd just follow and corner me again. Then I remembered something from a wildlife safety course. When facing a predator, you don't just run. You make yourself a harder target. You change the equation. I already sent a message. I blurted out, pulling my satellite messenger from my pocket with my left hand while keeping the bear spray ready in my right. GPS coordinates, description of the clearing, everything. It went out 20 minutes ago before I even found your little collection. It was a complete lie. The messenger was still in safety mode, hadn't transmitted anything, but his eyes flickered to the device, and for the first time, uncertainty crossed his face. You're lying. Check your watch, I said, gaining confidence from his hesitation. It's 3:47. At 4 Gand, if I don't send an all-clear signal, my emergency contacts get automatically notified with my last coordinates. That's 17 minutes from now. You really want to take that risk? I was making it all up, but I delivered it with enough conviction that he actually checked his watch. That 2-second distraction was all I needed. I pulled the trigger on the bear spray, and an orange stream shot out, catching him across the face. He screamed, dropping the knife and clawing at his eyes. I didn't stick around to watch. I ran along the cliff edge, following it until it sloped down into manageable terrain, then crashed through the forest in what I prayed was the right direction. My GPS watch saved my life. Even as I ran, I kept glancing at it, watching the digital breadcrumb trail that showed me where I deviated from the main trail. I followed that path in reverse, ignoring the burning in my lungs and the branches tearing at my skin and clothes. I hit the main trail, after what felt like hours, but was probably 10 minutes, and I didn't stop running. I covered the remaining 8 miles to the road access point in just under 2 hours. A personal record I never want to break again. A retired couple in an RV was parked at the trailhead. I must have looked absolutely insane, bloody from scratches, gasping for air, wild-eyed. The woman took one look at me and called 911 while her husband gave me water and tried to calm me down. The Arkansas State Police took my statement, sent a team into the woods with my GPS coordinates. They found the clearing exactly where I described it. They found 23 personal items from different people displayed around that pole. 23. And only 11 of those items matched missing persons reports. The other 12? They're still trying to identify them. They never found him. Despite dogs, helicopters, a 3-day search involving multiple agencies, he vanished into those woods like smoke. The detective assigned to the case told me the really terrifying part. They found evidence of multiple other clearings, other collections, scattered throughout a 50-mile radius of interconnected trail systems across 3 national forests. He'd been doing this across state lines for potentially decades. I still hike, though now I carry more than just bear spray. Personal locator beacon that actually does what I lied about. Better satellite communication. I've even taken some self-defense courses specifically designed for wilderness scenarios. But the biggest change is this. I never deviate from marked trails anymore. Never. No matter how curious I get, no matter how inviting that unmarked path looks, because now I know that those ribbons weren't trail markers. They were fishing lures. And somewhere out there, in forests and wilderness areas across the country, I guarantee there are more. More collections, more clearings, more hunters who've learned that the easiest prey are the confident hikers who think their experience makes them invincible. The detective calls me every few months with updates. 3 more clearings found. 2 arrests in different states using similar methods. But he always ends the call the same way, with the same chilling reminder that keeps me up at night. The items we've found suggest at least 40 victims across 6 states, and we haven't even scratched the surface of the wilderness areas we need to search. That man is still out there. And those ribbons? They're still hanging in the trees, waiting for the next curious hiker who thinks they're too experienced to become a victim. It happened on the Glacier Peak Wilderness Trail System in Washington State, a remote section of the North Cascades that I'd guided through at least 40 times. I was leading a group of 6 experienced hikers on a 3-day trek, all of them paying premium rates for what they thought would be a secluded, exclusive experience away from the crowds. We were camped at Lost Lake, a beautiful alpine site about 12 miles from the nearest road access, when everything went catastrophically wrong. It started innocently enough. One of the hikers, a woman named Patricia from Seattle, complained that she'd left her insulin injector at the previous night's camp, about 8 miles back down the trail. Now, here's where my years of experience betrayed me. Instead of waiting until morning to organize a proper search with the full group, I made a decision that still haunts me. Patricia had type 1 diabetes and was genuinely worried about her blood sugar levels. I told the rest of the group to stay put, make dinner, secure the camp, while I took Patricia back to retrace our route to find the injector. Just the 2 of us. 8 miles. In the dark. It should have taken us 90 minutes round trip. I had a powerful headlamp, GPS coordinates of our previous camp, and felt completely confident. Patricia was nervous but grateful. We set out at around 6:30 p.m., when the sun had just dipped below the mountains and the sky was that deep purple color that comes right before full darkness. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail was well marked, relatively flat, and I kept a steady pace to keep our body heat up in the cooling mountain air. Patricia kept up without complaining, her breathing steady, her steps confident. We talked about her job, my other expeditions, the beauty of the wilderness at night. Normal conversation, normal hike. That's when we found the first camp. It wasn't marked on any map I had. It wasn't on the official list of designated campsites for this wilderness area. But there it was, tucked into a small clearing about 50 yards off the trail, a perfectly maintained tent, a fire ring with fresh ashes, a cooler, and a backpack hung from a tree branch using proper bear-hanging technique. Maybe someone else is hiking this area, Patricia suggested, but I wasn't so sure. Everything about this camp felt wrong. The precision of it, the organization, the fact that there were no personal touches, no indication of who'd set this up or when. "Come on," I said, pulling Patricia back toward the trail. Not our business. But I'd already made a mental note of the location and was planning to report it to the ranger station. Unregistered camps could be fire hazards, and the organization of this one suggested it might be used regularly. We continued on, and about 3 miles further down the trail we found another camp, then another. 5 in total, all positioned roughly 2 miles apart, all perfectly maintained, all completely empty. It was like someone had stationed supply caches throughout the wilderness, creating a network of bases. My unease morphed into genuine alarm. "Patricia, I need to make a decision," I said, stopping on the trail and checking my GPS. "These camps are not registered, they shouldn't be here. Something feels off about this whole situation." "What do you mean?" She looked worried now, picking up on my tension. "I mean, we're turning back. Right now. We're getting back to the main group and we're reporting this to the rangers in the morning. Your insulin can wait. We have backup supplies in the main camp." We turned around, and that's when I noticed something that made my blood freeze. On the tree nearest to where we'd stopped, someone had carved something into the bark. Not recently. This was old, maybe months old, but deliberately carved in letters about 6 inches high. Marked just that one word. Marked. I pulled out my phone and took a photo before we rushed back toward the main camp. The hike back felt different. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound, and the wilderness is never completely silent. There are always rustlings, distant animal calls. Felt deliberately positioned to unsettle us. I kept my hand on the bear spray on my hip, and my headlamp sweeping constantly across the trail ahead. We were about 6 miles from the main camp when we heard the first scream. It wasn't human. At least not entirely. It was a sound that could have been a mountain lion or a bear, but something about it felt staged, theatrical even. It echoed through the dark forest and Patricia grabbed my arm. "What was that?" she whispered. Mountain lion, probably. I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. We're fine. We're together. We have light. We're making noise. Let's just move. But we were moving faster now, and I was monitoring my GPS obsessively. The main camp was 4 miles away. We could make it in 45 minutes if we pushed. That's when I saw the figure on the trail ahead. It was standing perfectly still directly in our path about 30 feet away. In the beam of my headlamp I could make out a human shape. Tall, wearing dark clothes, face obscured by shadow. It didn't move when my light hit it. Just stood there. "Excuse me," I called out, trying to sound confident despite my accelerating heart rate. "We're hiking through. Please step aside." The figure didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there like a statue, watching us. I pushed Patricia slightly behind me and stepped forward, my hand moving to the bear spray. "I'm serious. Step aside." The moment I took that step forward, the figure simply disappeared into the forest to the right, moving silently into the darkness without making a sound. Not running, just stepping smoothly off the trail and vanishing like it had never been there. "Okay, we're running now," I said to Patricia, and we started moving as fast as we could safely move in the dark on an unfamiliar trail. My headlamp bounced crazily, creating disorienting shadows. Patricia was breathing hard, scared, and I was beyond frightened. I was entering that space where training takes over and survival instinct dominates. We'd gone about a mile at this faster pace when I heard voices. Multiple people coming from ahead on the trail, having a conversation like they were out for a casual evening stroll. "Just keep moving," one male voice said. "They'll come this way," a female voice responded. "They always do. They panic and they run straight toward the main camp." I pulled Patricia off the trail violently, nearly dragging her into the dense forest. We crouched behind a massive fallen log, and I put my hand over her mouth to muffle her panicked breathing. Through a gap in the undergrowth, I could see headlamps approaching. Not one or two, at least 4 separate lights moving with coordinated purpose down the trail, in the exact direction we would have gone. "How many groups are out tonight?" one of them asked. "3 we know of," another voice answered. "The main expedition group is bigger, 5 people plus the guide's girlfriend or something. Then there's the solo hiker we marked 2 days ago, and now these 2 who split off. It's a good night." They passed within 15 feet of our hiding spot, and I held Patricia so tightly I was afraid I might hurt her. She was shaking, her hand clamped over her own mouth, terror radiating off her in waves. After they passed, I waited 5 full minutes before I even moved. Then I pulled Patricia close and whispered directly into her ear, so quietly I could barely hear myself. "We're not going to the main camp. They're expecting us there. We're going off trail, due east, toward the highway. It's about 5 miles cross-country. Can you do it?" She nodded, tears streaming down her face. What followed was the most terrifying hike of my life. No trail, just dense forest in the dark, guided by GPS coordinates I was programming into my watch. We had to move slowly to avoid serious injury, but quickly enough to stay ahead of whoever was hunting us. The forest fought every inch. Thorn bushes tore at our clothes and skin. Fallen logs forced us to climb over them. The terrain constantly shifted between ravines and rocky slopes. My mind was processing fragments of information with crystalline clarity. Those camps weren't supply caches. They were checkpoints, positioned to track and intercept hikers. The marked carving. We were marked, somehow, probably noted when we registered for the expedition or checked in at the trailhead. And the main group at Lost Lake, they were bait, a distraction. This was organized. This was practiced. This was a hunting operation targeting wilderness tourists. We pushed through the forest for what felt like hours but was probably closer to 2. My legs burned, my lungs felt like they were on fire, and Patricia was crying silently as we moved. But we kept going because the alternative, stopping, meant they'd find us. Around 11 p.m. we finally emerged onto a logging road, a rough dirt track used by Forest Service vehicles. I flagged down a truck that happened to be coming through, a miracle really that anyone would be on that road at that hour. And the driver, a confused timber inspector, took us to the ranger station 15 miles away. The response was immediate and massive. By midnight, there were state police, FBI, search and rescue teams being mobilized. They sent a helicopter to Lost Lake and found the main camp empty. All 4 of the other hikers, gone. Their gear was still there, tents set up, supplies laid out, but the people had vanished. The search lasted 3 days. They found evidence of a large operation. Buildings hidden deep in the forest, registration records showing names of hikers and expedition groups dating back over 2 years, photographs, detailed notes. What they didn't find were the people running it. Whoever had organized this operation had apparently decided it was time to disappear. Of the other 4 hikers, 2 were located in the next week, confused and disoriented, apparently drugged with some kind of sedative. They had no memory of what happened after we left the camp. The other 2 were never found. The FBI classified it as a human trafficking operation, though they were vague about details. The theory was that they were using the wilderness to isolate hikers, transport them to a larger network, potentially sell them into situations I don't want to think about. The operation had been running for at least 2 years, possibly longer, targeting national wilderness areas across the Pacific Northwest. 3 men were eventually arrested when a cabin was found in Oregon, but the suspected ringleader was never caught. He's still out there somewhere, according to the case file I was allowed to review. Patricia and I both struggle with PTSD from the experience. She hasn't hiked since that night, and I took a year off from guiding. When I finally went back to it, I insisted on significantly smaller groups, GPS trackers for every participant, and strict communication protocols with ranger stations. But here's what haunts me more than the fear I experienced that night. The realization of how many hikers pass through wilderness areas completely unaware that these operations exist. How many people register at trailheads and provide personal information to people who might not have their safety in mind. How many solo hikers and small groups are out there right now, completely vulnerable, trusting that the wilderness is just wilderness. The wilderness is beautiful and wild and largely benign, but in certain areas, at certain times, it's also being used as a hunting ground. The rangers I spoke to after the incident told me that they've found similar evidence of organized operations in at least 7 other national wilderness areas across the country. And the really terrifying part? They have no idea how many operations they haven't found yet, or how many people have simply disappeared and been written off as hiking accidents or lost in the mountains. The call came in at 9:47 p.m. on a cold October evening. A female voice, shaky and frightened, reporting that her hiking partner had fallen and was seriously injured on the Bear Creek Trail, about 7 miles from the nearest trailhead. She said he was bleeding heavily, possibly had a broken leg, and she couldn't move him alone. The cell signal was barely functional, cutting in and out, but the coordinates she provided pinpointed a location deep in a ravine that matched the trail system. Standard protocol would have been to wait until morning for a full search and rescue team mobilization. But the woman kept insisting the injury was severe, life-threatening even. She was crying, begging for help, saying he was losing consciousness. I made a judgment call that I've regretted every single day since. I grabbed my emergency pack, loaded my truck, and drove to the trailhead alone, planning to do a preliminary assessment and call for the full team once I had visual confirmation. The temperature had dropped to 38 degrees, and there was no moon that night. My flashlight was my only guide as I started up the trail at a near run, my ranger's pack heavy on my back, but nothing compared to the weight of responsibility I felt. A man's life depended on me getting there fast. The trail was steep and rocky, winding through dense pine forest that seemed to absorb the beam of my flashlight, creating a tunnel effect where I could only see about 30 feet ahead. Behind and around me was absolute darkness, the kind of darkness that only exists far from civilization, where the trees are thick enough to block out starlight. I made it to mile 3 in just over 40 minutes, pushing my body hard. That's when I noticed the first thing that didn't fit the scenario. On the side of the trail, partially hidden behind a fallen log, was a backpack. Not weathered by time, not damaged, a relatively new backpack, sitting there almost deliberately positioned. I should have radioed it in. I should have stopped and assessed. But the woman's terrified voice kept echoing in my head, and I convinced myself this was probably just a day pack that had been abandoned when they tried to move the injured hiker. I left it and kept moving. Mile 4. The trail had become more treacherous with loose scree and exposed rock. I was moving carefully now, watching my footing when I heard the voice. "Help! Please, somebody help me!" It was a man's voice this time, coming from down the ravine to my left. Weak, pained, desperate. Exactly what I'd expected to hear. "This is Colorado Parks and Wildlife," I shouted back. "Ranger Morrison, I'm coming down to you." I carefully descended into the ravine, using trees for support, my boots sliding on loose stone. The beam of my flashlight swept across the darkness, and I could see the bottom of the ravine about 60 feet below, a small creek running through it, large boulders scattered along the banks. And there, crumpled against one of those boulders, apparently tangled in a sleeping bag, was a figure. I could see the bright color of what looked like emergency blanket material, and the man was moaning, his arm positioned at an angle that suggested a serious fracture. I rappelled down into the ravine using the emergency rope from my pack, taking care with each movement. The air down here was colder, damper, and something about it felt wrong, though I couldn't articulate why. My training told me to focus on the patient and the rescue. As I got closer, I could see him more clearly. Young man, maybe mid-20s, face twisted in pain, one leg positioned at a sickening angle. Everything about him screamed injured hiker. "Hey, buddy," I said, kneeling beside him. "I'm going to assess your injuries. Can you tell me your name?" "Marcus," he gasped out. "My girlfriend called you. My leg is bad, really bad. I think I broke it in at least 2 places." I did a rapid assessment. His left leg was definitely broken, possibly a compound fracture, and he had a nasty gash on his forehead that had bled enough to make his shirt sticky. But something about his vital signs felt off. His pupils weren't dilating correctly. His breathing was too measured, too controlled for someone in severe pain. "Marcus, I'm going to need to..." That's when I heard the voices above us, multiple people approaching down the trail, moving fast. My instincts screamed danger. Rangers don't respond to calls in groups that size. Search and rescue takes time to mobilize. These voices sounded coordinated, organized, like people who knew exactly where they were going. I looked at Marcus, and that's when I saw it. The briefest flicker of awareness in his eyes. A split-second communication between him and whoever was coming down the ravine. His injury suddenly looked a lot less genuine. I stood up and backed away from him, my hand moving to the bear spray and whistle on my belt. "What the hell is this?" "Don't do anything stupid," a male voice said from above. I looked up to see at least 4 figures descending into the ravine, moving with practiced efficiency. They weren't wearing ranger uniforms. They weren't carrying standard rescue equipment. I had maybe 3 seconds to make a choice, fight or flight. I chose flight. I ran. Not toward the figures descending, but parallel to the ravine, scrambling over rocks and debris, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. Behind me, I heard them shouting, heard the sounds of pursuit. My ranger training took over. I knew these mountains. These predators did not. I cut away from the ravine, scrambling up the steep slope toward the forest. The elevation gain was brutal on my legs, but it was also my advantage. They were following me, but they were making noise, crashing through the underbrush while I was moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent 14 years hiking these exact terrain types in all conditions. I reached the main trail after what felt like an eternity, my lungs burning, my legs screaming. I could still hear them down the slope behind me, but they were farther away now, losing ground. I pulled out my satellite communicator, much more reliable than cell signal at this elevation, and immediately transmitted a distress signal to the ranger station. "This is Ranger Morrison, officer in distress. Attempted abduction or robbery on Bear Creek Trail. Multiple suspects, possibly armed. I'm mobile, heading back to Trailhead. Send immediate backup." I didn't wait for a response. I just ran, staying on the trail where I could move fastest, my powerful ranger's flashlight cutting a path through the darkness. Behind me, the voices faded as they realized they couldn't catch me, that I was too familiar with this terrain, that their trap had failed. I made it back to the trailhead in what had to be close to a personal record, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. My truck was still there, untouched. I locked myself inside and radioed the ranger station continuously until backup arrived 15 minutes later. 4 ranger vehicles and a sheriff's deputy. We organized an immediate team and went back up the trail. But the ravine was empty. Marcus was gone. The figures were gone. The only thing left was that backpack I'd seen earlier, which contained personal identification of someone reported missing in Wyoming 3 months ago. The investigation that followed was extensive. The backpack belonged to a man named David Chen, who'd gone missing while hiking near the border of Colorado and Wyoming. He was never found. The GPS coordinates the woman had provided from her initial call turned out to be spoofed, a technique that made it look like the signal was coming from the Bear Creek Trail when it actually wasn't. The FBI got involved and determined this was part of an organized operation targeting wilderness rangers, specifically trying to lure individual rangers into isolated areas where they could be overwhelmed, robbed, possibly worse. There had been at least 3 similar incidents in the previous year at different national forests that police hadn't connected until my incident made them review old cases with fresh eyes. They never arrested anyone. The operation apparently had contingency protocols for when one of their lures was discovered. After my incident, the tactics simply shifted to different trailheads, different rangers, different wilderness areas. But here's what the FBI agents told me during the investigation that still keeps me awake at night. The backup plans they have are sophisticated. The way they coordinated the fake distress call with multiple operatives staged in the forest suggests a network, not just a handful of criminals. This is probably operating in at least 5 different national forests that we can identify. Possibly more that we haven't connected yet. I continued working as a ranger, but my entire approach to distress calls changed. I never respond alone anymore, no matter how urgent the call seems. I always verify with base camp. I always wait for backup. And I always trust my instincts over the details of a story. The woman's voice from that night still haunts me. The way she sounded so genuinely frightened, so convincingly desperate. She was a professional, trained to manipulate someone exactly like me, someone who chose this job specifically because they wanted to help people, to save lives. That instinct to help is what almost got me killed or worse. And every time I'm on the trail now, I wonder how many actual emergencies go unreported because people don't trust the system anymore. How many hikers suffer from real injuries because they're afraid to call for help, afraid of what might show up instead of rescue. Because somewhere in these mountains right now, there are people setting traps, recording fake distress calls, waiting to lure the next unsuspecting ranger or hiker into their carefully constructed nightmare. And they're getting better at it every time. The assignment seemed perfect. Document elk migration patterns in the remote Sawtooth Mountains of Idaho for a National Geographic piece. I'd spent 3 weeks setting up motion-activated trail cameras along known migration routes, hiking solo to some of the most isolated terrain in the lower 48. This was my specialty, getting deep into wilderness areas where few people ventured, capturing wildlife behavior that most people would never see. My cameras were state-of-the-art military-grade equipment worth about $3,000 each. I'd positioned them strategically along game trails, near water sources, at natural choke points where elk would be forced to pass through. Standard protocol was to check them every 10 days, download the footage, adjust positioning if needed. The morning of November 15th, I hiked 8 miles into the backcountry to check camera station 7. Positioned overlooking a creek crossing that elk used regularly. The hike took me through dense lodgepole pine forest, across 2 ridgelines, into terrain so remote that my GPS showed me as a solitary dot surrounded by hundreds of square miles of unmarked wilderness. When I reached the station, my first thought was relief. The camera was still there, still properly secured to the tree, solar panel intact. Theft is always a concern with expensive equipment in remote areas. But when I downloaded the SD card and scrolled through the footage on my tablet, I found something that made my blood freeze. Mixed in with hundreds of clips of elk, deer, and the occasional black bear was footage of me. Not just from that morning's hike, from previous visits over the past 3 weeks. The camera had been repositioned slightly, just a few degrees, enough to capture not just the wildlife crossing but also the approach trail I used to reach the station. Someone had been watching my surveillance footage. They knew exactly when I came to check the cameras, what route I took, how long I stayed, what equipment I carried. And they'd been documenting my patterns for weeks. My hands shook as I scrolled through the clips. There I was 3 weeks ago setting up the camera for the first time. There I was 10 days ago, downloading footage, completely unaware that someone had already accessed this camera and altered its positioning. And there, time-stamped just 6 hours before my arrival that morning, was footage of 2 figures approaching the camera in the pre-dawn darkness. They moved with purpose, like they knew exactly where the camera was positioned. One of them carried what looked like a laptop, the other had climbing gear. They accessed my camera, downloaded the footage, then carefully repositioned it, and uploaded something back onto the SD card before disappearing into the forest. I was being hunted, systematically tracked by people who understood technology, who had been monitoring my location and movement patterns, who knew I'd be returning to this exact spot at this exact time. I immediately checked the other footage on the card, scrolling through days of clips, and found more evidence that chilled me to the bone. Starting about 2 weeks ago, there were clips of the same 2 figures at different times, always at night, always carrying equipment. But worse than that, there were clips of them setting up their own cameras, hidden cameras, positioned to monitor the approaches to my camera stations. They weren't just stealing my footage. They were building their own surveillance network, using my camera positions as anchor points to track wildlife photographers and researchers who worked in remote areas. I was part of a larger operation. I needed to get out of there immediately. But first, I had to know how extensive this was. Against every survival instinct screaming at me, I pulled up the GPS coordinates of my other camera stations and started cross-referencing them with the timestamps on this footage. All of them. Every single camera I'd positioned over the past 3 weeks had been compromised. These people had a complete map of my research area, my schedule, my equipment locations. They knew where I'd been and where I was going next. I packed up my equipment as quickly as possible, but I made a critical mistake. In my panic to leave, I followed the same trail I'd used to approach the station, the trail that was now being monitored by their hidden cameras. I was so focused on getting away that I walked straight into their surveillance network. About 2 miles from the camera station, I noticed fresh boot prints in the mud beside a creek crossing. Not old prints weathered by rain and wind. These were hours old, maybe less, and they matched the tread pattern I'd seen in the camera footage. I stopped dead in my tracks, realizing I'd made a terrible tactical error. If they had cameras monitoring the approaches to my stations, they knew I'd discovered their operation. They knew I was hiking out with evidence, and they knew exactly which trail I'd take to reach the main road. I pulled out my satellite phone to call for help, but there was no signal, not unusual at this elevation surrounded by ridge lines. I'd have to hike to higher ground to get connectivity, but that meant staying on the trail system they were monitoring. That's when I heard the voices, not distant voices carried by wind. Close voices, maybe a quarter-mile behind me on the same trail. Male voices, talking casually like they were out for a pleasant day hike. But I knew better. They were following me, and they weren't trying to be subtle about it anymore. I left the trail immediately, crashing through dense underbrush toward a steep slope that would take me up and over the ridgeline to a different drainage system. It was brutal terrain, loose scree and thick brush that tore at my clothes and equipment, but it was terrain they couldn't monitor with cameras. The climb nearly killed me. My photography pack, loaded with expensive camera equipment, felt like it weighed 100 pounds. My boots slipped on loose rock, and I had to use my hands to pull myself up steep sections, my gloves shredding on sharp stone edges. But I could hear them behind me, below me, trying to follow my route. I crested the ridgeline after what felt like hours of brutal climbing, and found myself looking down into a completely different valley. No trails, no camera positions, no surveillance network. Just raw wilderness that offered both protection and the terrifying possibility of getting completely lost. But I had no choice. I descended into the valley and started following a creek downstream, knowing it would eventually lead to lower elevation and hopefully cell phone signal. The water was ice cold, and I had to cross it multiple times as the terrain forced me back and forth across the drainage. After about 3 hours of hiking in this unknown valley, I finally got a single bar of cell signal on my satellite phone. I immediately called 911, but the connection was terrible, breaking up constantly. I managed to convey my GPS coordinates, that I was being pursued by multiple suspects, and that this involved surveillance equipment and possible organized crime before the connection died. I kept moving downstream, following the creek as it carved through increasingly steep canyon walls. The temperature was dropping rapidly as evening approached, and I was soaked from multiple creek crossings. Hypothermia was becoming a real concern. Just as full darkness hit, I saw lights ahead. Artificial lights, not starlight. I approached carefully and found a backcountry research station, a small cabin used by Forest Service biologists during seasonal wildlife studies. It was locked, but I'd done enough work with government agencies to know the emergency protocols. I broke a window, got inside, and used their radio system to contact the authorities. The response was immediate and comprehensive. By morning, there were FBI agents, Forest Service officers, and Idaho State Police conducting a coordinated search of the entire area. They recovered all of my camera equipment, plus an extensive network of hidden surveillance cameras that had been monitoring at least 12 different research sites across a 50-square-mile area. The investigation revealed something far more sinister than simple equipment theft. This was a sophisticated operation targeting researchers, wildlife photographers, and backcountry workers who carried valuable equipment into remote areas. They'd been using stolen trail camera footage to map the movements of their potential targets, then ambushing them in areas where help was days away. The FBI found evidence linking this operation to at least 6 missing persons cases over the past 2 years. Researchers and photographers who'd gone into remote wilderness areas and never returned. Their equipment would be recovered and resold, their vehicles found at trailheads with no clues about what happened to them. They arrested 3 men, but the investigation suggested a larger network operating across multiple states, targeting anyone who worked alone in wilderness areas where disappearances could easily be attributed to accidents or getting lost. I continued my photography work, but everything changed after that experience. I never work alone anymore. I use encrypted communication systems and randomized scheduling that can't be tracked through predictable patterns. Most importantly, I constantly monitor my own equipment for signs of tampering. But the psychological impact goes deeper than just operational security. Every time I'm reviewing trail camera footage now, I scan for human figures in the background. Every time I'm hiking to a camera station, I'm analyzing the terrain for signs of surveillance. The wilderness, which used to be my sanctuary, now feels like a place where I'm potentially being watched, tracked, hunted. The FBI agent who handled my case told me something that still gives me nightmares. The sophistication of their surveillance network suggests this operation had been running for years before you discovered it. They'd perfected their methods by tracking dozens, maybe hundreds of researchers who never realized they were being monitored. Most of their victims probably never knew they were in danger until it was too late. The 3 men they arrested refused to provide information about the larger network, and the case file suggests similar operations are active in at least 7 other wilderness areas across the western United States. Rangers and researchers are finding hidden cameras in places they've never been before, suggesting that this method of surveillance and predation is spreading. And the most terrifying part? Right now, somewhere in the wilderness, there are trail cameras positioned not to monitor wildlife, but to monitor the people who think they're alone in the forest. People like me, people like you, people who believe that the biggest threat in the wilderness comes from wild animals, not from predators who've learned to use our own technology against us. It started as a routine training hike, nothing dramatic, just conditioning for an early season ascent I had planned in the White River National Forest. I'd finished a snowshoe loop before dusk and decided to tack on 3 more miles, using an old Forest Service access road that paralleled a highway, the kind of backdoor route maintenance crews use to reach trailheads after storms. The night was clear and brittle, the kind of cold that makes your nostrils stick together. The stars felt close enough to touch. Down below, beyond the black wall of lodgepole pine, semi-trucks whispered along the interstate in a steady, comforting ribbon, civilization humming just out of sight. I'd done this loop a dozen times. The access road was plowed a few times each winter by contractors and otherwise left to ice and drift. It felt safe in that familiar, quiet way. The crunch of my snowshoes, the slow ghost breath of my headlamp beam, frost pluming from my mouth. The forest around me was motionless, dense and watchful. I'd always liked that feeling, containment without threat. Professional calm. Half a mile in, the wind shifted and carried faint voices up the corridor of trees. Not close, not alarming, just the kind of echoes you get from a highway on cold air. I kept moving, counting strides, letting the rhythm settle. Then I saw it. A hazard triangle reflecting my headlamp from the snow. Fresh boot prints too, one set deep and crisp, leading away from the road's crown and down a narrow spur that cut toward the highway. At the end of that spur, the trees opened on a short slope to a gravel pullout hidden from drivers, like a pocket at the base of the embankment. Parked inside it, nose in, engine off, frost filmed across the windshield, was a silver SUV with the rear passenger door hanging open. One taillight was out. It was quiet enough to hear the antifreeze tick in the radiator. "Hey," a man called from somewhere to my right, down the slope. Strained, ragged. "Please, over here." The sound of someone in trouble never confused me. You move with caution. You control the scene. You assess. Simple. I stepped off the access road, snowshoes biting the crust, and angled down. My headlamp drifted across heavy footprints and a ragged skid trail like someone had fallen and dragged themselves. The slope leveled into a narrow shelf between trunks and rocks where the snow was churned up, dirty, melted, refrozen. "Hold on," I called, drawing in angles and distances in my head. "I'm coming." The voice came again, but softer, like the speaker had turned their head away. "Hurry, I'm bleeding." A shiver threaded up my spine that had nothing to do with wind. It wasn't the content, it was the cadence, too controlled, too evenly spaced. It reminded me of recorded SOS calls used in avalanche training. The same breath length, the same stressed emphasis, the same pause afterward, as if cued. I've taught first aid to guides for a decade. You learn to catalog details without letting your face show it. The open door of the SUV, the triangle placed perfectly at 40 yards. The prints that entered the shelf turned a tight circle, then multiplied. The heel bites and toe scrapes of more than one person moving at different times. A cluster of depressions sat against the dark trunk of a spruce-like knees had been resting there, waiting. I kept moving but slower, my light low, my breath quiet. "What's your name?" I asked, because a real emergency gives you a name quickly, a reflex. Silence for a beat. "Evan," the voice said, a fraction late. "How old are you, Evan?" Another beat. 30. I kicked aside a crust and saw the torn corner of a cardboard box peeking up. Industrial zip ties, the kind with a stainless cinch. On the trunk beside it, a dull smudge where a hand had rested and left oil or something darker. Under my headlamp, the smudge did not reflect. I stopped and shifted right where the shelf narrowed between 2 trees. The snowpack dipped, a subtle sag in an otherwise unbroken plate. It was the kind of shape you only notice when your life has depended on not stepping wrong. A shallow pit, tamped, covered, and dusted with new snow. A deadfall trap that wouldn't kill you. Just eat your knees and make your fight short. My pulse hammered. My mouth dried. Somewhere behind the trees ahead, maybe 15 yards, I caught a second sound layered under the wind, the faint scrape of fabric against bark. the kind of tiny noise a person makes when they put a glove back on. "I see you," I said, even though I didn't. "You're behind the spruce left of the boulder. In the woods, words are tools. You use them to break scripts. A real victim would cry harder, try to be seen. A lie would have to adjust." The voice came again, strained, closer now, but somehow identical. "Please, I can't move." Identical. The exact pitch, the exact ragged inhale, like someone had thumbed back the clip and pressed play. I took one step back, then two, flattening my snowshoes to spread weight, moving the way you back out of a cornice. I breathed through my nose and kept my light low, scanning angles, escape lines. Another sound floated in, the idle burble of an engine, muted by the embankment, then the pop of a car door. Up on the highway beyond the snow berm, a pair of headlights slowed to a crawl. A driver had probably seen the open SUV door with one dead taillight and pulled over. A good Samaritan. Exactly the kind you could count on to climb down that slope if a voice asked. In that moment, a plan snapped into focus. They weren't trying to ambush me. I was a bonus. The real bait sat 100 feet behind me. The open door, the hazard triangle, the story assembled like a crime scene diorama. The trap wasn't in the trees. The trap was time. All they needed was anyone with empathy and a bad instinct to hurry. I don't remember choosing to run. I remember the survival system taking the reins and my body following orders. I pivoted on my left shoe, planted, and drove back up the slope in a low, canted sprint, hands digging into the snowpack, light off, letting starlight and the gray sheen of old ice guide me. Branches whipped my face. My heart thudded hard enough to blur my hearing. Behind me, someone moved. Fast now. Purposeful. The gloved scrape was gone, replaced by the crunch of feet committing to the chase. Another voice, this one real, close, male, called out, "Hey, easy. We just need a hand." A second voice answered from my right. Too calm, too unbothered. "Don't let him get up the road." I didn't look back. Looking back is for people with energy to spare. I reached the cut in the trees where the spur hit the service road and launched myself sideways, landing in a slide, letting momentum carry me across the hard crown and into the shallow ditch on the far side. In the same motion, I tore the avalanche cord from my pack and yanked, dumping a brutal cloud of fluorescent dye across the snow. It wasn't what it was designed for, but bright color is bright color. Chaos buys seconds. A beam of light sliced the road behind me from low ground as someone crested the slope, but the dye cloud lit up like a gas flare under my headlamp, an exploding orange fog that turned my shadow into a smear, and their depth perception into mush. I shoved into the trees opposite the spur, headlamp off again, counting steps, threading trunks by muscle memory and the pale ribbon of sky between branches. The interstate's white noise swelled and fell, then swelled again as a semi took the grade. I had 3 priorities that stacked in my head like cards: put distance, get altitude for signal, and disrupt the script at the car before anyone else became a target. I pulled my phone and hit the SOS hard press sequence with my thumb while moving. In the black, I could feel the vibration when the call engaged, then the freeze frame eternity of the first ring, and then a dispatcher, steady and unflappable, on the line. I fed coordinates like I was reading a grocery list, cleared my voice of panic the way training teaches you, and added the sentence that mattered most. There's a decoy vehicle staged at mile marker sign 211 eastbound shoulder below the service road. Open door, 1 taillight out, hazard triangle. Do not approach. Repeat, do not approach. Suspects on foot and concealed. Stay on the line, the dispatcher said. Officers are en route. Can you remain concealed? I can do better, I said, the old arrogance coughing back to life in a form that might actually help. I can move. Sometimes all the years collapse into one limb. I moved like I did when I was 22 teaching night navigation. No lights, low and quiet, counting paces, palming bark to feel the compass of lichens and wind. The service road paralleled a barbed right-of-way fence beyond a thin stand of trees. I cut toward it. The snow was wind-scoured along the wire, thinner, faster. I could run there. Behind me on the spur, Voices bounced around the trunks. He went left. No, that die. Stay out of it. Truck on the shoulder. Move now. Their priorities were fracturing, me, and the real prize up top. If I'd timed it wrong, if I'd been slower, this would be a different story. It wouldn't be mine to tell. I reached the fence and slid along it, the wire thrumming lightly under a gust. Another quarter-mile and a break in the trees opened to a cut in the embankment, an old maintenance gate spot, the wire replaced by a hinged section secured with a loop and pin. I popped the pin with numb fingers, swung the fence inward, and clambered up the hard-packed snow ramp to the shoulder. Eastbound, 30 yards away, a sedan idled, hazard lights ticking. A woman in a parka stood by her open door, craning toward the drop as if listening for that same ragged male voice. There was no one else. Not yet. "Ma'am," I shouted as I jogged across the shoulder, authority in my tone like a borrowed badge. "Back in your car and lock the doors now. Highway patrol is en route. The vehicle below is a decoy." She startled, blinked, then, thank God, moved. I reached her door as she was half in, half out, and shoved it closed with a flat palm, the way you do when you don't have time to be polite. Through the glass, she looked at me with wide, confused eyes. I held up my phone to the window, the dispatcher still on, and mouthed, "Police." That was enough. She hit the locks, put the car in drive, and pulled away, trembling hands tight on the wheel. Headlights crested behind her. 2, then 3. Law enforcement running dark so their approach wouldn't spook anyone below. An officer rolled to a stop, cracked the passenger window, and I gave them the short version. The message went out on their radios like a pulse. Do not approach the disabled vehicle. Perimeter only. Suspects on foot, armed, unknown. Down in the trees, the voices changed flavor. Control bled out. Someone hissed, "Abort." And then there was the frantic crash of retreat. The same forest that gives you cover punishes you when you're rushing blind. A man exploded out of the spur farther down, saw the cruiser lights angling to box the pullout, and turned back into the trees. Another tried the embankment and slid, hands flailing, before catching a root and clawing back down. A trooper took 2 steps down the slope behind a door shield and called commands that snapped the cold air. "Hands, hands!" I stayed at the fence line, every nerve about to vibrate apart. It's one thing to run. It's another to stop and let the adrenaline look for a place to go. The arrests took an hour and 2 canine sweeps. The scene changed from silent, predatory patients to floodlights, radios, and method. Boot tracks photographed, zip ties cataloged, the SUV dusted. The hazard triangle even bagged and labeled like a black comedy prop. A tow pulled the decoy up the embankment with a winch, and its underside told a story. Plates swapped, V-ine ground off, quick spray of gray primer over original paint. The rear seat had been removed entirely. The floor showed anchor points drilled and reinforced. They weren't improvising. They'd done this. Maybe not here, maybe not this exact configuration, but they'd refined a pattern. The kind of pattern built on predictable kindness and winter darkness. At the station, with a styrofoam cup leaching heat into my hands, I gave a statement that felt like it belonged to somebody else. The detective, a woman with a runner's frame and a voice that never changed speed, asked the right questions. How many voices? Which direction first? Exact phrasing, the cadence of the Evan call. When I mentioned the identical delivery, her eyes ticked up. "Like a loop?" "Like a loop," I said. They pulled one of the suspect's phones 6 hours later on a warrant. It held audio files named in plain text. Hurt, male, 01, hurt, female, 02, child crying far. Different scripts for different drivers. There were notes on staging nights that provided the best results. Sundays for out-of-town traffic, heavy snow for friction, holidays for people visiting parents and trying to be better than they were last year. In the days that followed, more fell out. The SUV was linked to 2 other vehicles recovered in neighboring states with similar modifications. Camera stills from a different highway showed the same hazard triangle a week earlier, in a different storm, at a different mile marker. Cross-checks revealed robbery reports that had felt disconnected at the time. No bodies, no dramatic violence, just the slow bleed of winter desperation. Wallets gone, phones taken, victims humiliated, and then left to climb out of ravines on shaky legs. 2 reports described zip ties that were for show, not used. 2 more described zip ties that were not. I slept badly and then mostly not at all. When sleep came, it was cold and shallow and full of the sound of a voice saying a name with the wrong kind of pain. You don't get to flip a switch and love the dark again. You earn it back or you don't. I still hike at night sometimes because the night had nothing to do with them, and I refuse to surrender the only place that's ever felt honest. But the way I move is different now. I orbit highway shoulders, never approach vehicles staged in pockets without a verified call, never descend toward an open door unless there's a line of sight I control. My headlamp goes to my belt when I'm close to paved edges. Dark makes you invisible to more than one kind of predator. I share this not because it's cinematic, but because it's ordinary in the worst way. It wasn't a labyrinthine conspiracy buried deep in the backcountry. It was a shoulder, a triangle, a voice. It lived in the seam between wilderness and road, where people step out of cars and become pedestrians and forget that rules change when the trees start. The officers told me they'd seen copycats sprout as fast as arrests could be made. Different states, same script. The audio refined for regional accents and local slang. One detective said, "The pipeline's out there on forums. They trade playbooks like recipes." He said it softly, like someone ashamed of being right for a living. I've spent years comforting families convinced the woods took their people like a mouth. After that night, the woods felt more like a room where doors can't be locked and anyone can lean in to whisper your name in the kind of voice you're trained to answer. When I lace up boots now, I hear that first call in the cold air. Over here. And feel the pit under a skim of snow waiting for a knee. I imagine headlights slowing on a black ribbon above me and a stranger putting a car in park, because that's what good people do. And I wonder how many hazard triangles are set tonight on empty shoulders. How many open doors are angling toward the tree line. How many voices are queued up on a cracked phone screen, ready to press play. They don't all end in arrests. They don't all end at all. And if you're reading this on a phone while a wintry breeze sneaks through your car door seal, hazard lights ticking like a metronome in the dark, drive on. The voice isn't for you. It's for whoever stops next.